My guest on this episode of Suds Search is Kevin Indig, Director of SEO at Shopify. Kevin is a popular conference speaker, blogger, educator, and podcaster. A short list of conferences where you might have heard Kevin present includes Brighton SEO, Advanced Search Summit, AdWorld, and SMX Munich. For my money, Kevin is among the very best writers on topics related to SEO in the world. He has his own newsletter called the Growth Memo, which I highly recommend. He also has a recurring column at Search Engine Journal, which is equally outstanding. Kevin is really good at looking at large amounts of data and identifying patterns and learning lessons. One pattern that Kevin has noticed is an increase in the number of experiments Google is performing to better align their results to searcher intent. The result for marketers is analyzing what Kevin describes as an unstable SERP. I'll start our conversation unpacking that concept and asking how SERP volatility can actually present an opportunity for savvy marketers. Earlier this year, Kevin published a brilliant newsletter predicting changes to SEO and technology generally. I went through some of those predictions with Kevin, including one about whether or not Apple will launch their own search engine sometime this year. Grab something cold to drink and join me for a conversation with one of the most popular SEOs in the world, Kevin Indig. We'll talk about tactics to grow your organic traffic, his new role at Shopify, and a little bit about life as a Chicago-based SEO. Kevin Indig, welcome to Suds Search. How you doing?
Hey, I'm fantastic, Mark. Thanks. How are you?
Thanks for doing this on St. Patrick's Day. I hope I'm not keeping you from anything.
Yeah, it's one of the holiest holidays here in the U.S.
That's right.
We're good. We're good.
I appreciate it. So I saw online that you recently changed jobs. You are now the director of SEO at Shopify. First of all, congrats on the new role. How's the transition going?
Thanks. It's awesome, man. It wasn't necessarily planned from a career perspective, right? This opportunity more or less fell into my lap, but then I wanted to make sure I grab it. And Shopify it's a company at the stage where the ramp up time takes 3 to 6 months. It's a long ramp up. There's a lot of context to be gained, but it's a wild ride and so much joy every day, man. I enjoy it a lot. And to be fair, I loved my previous job at G2 as well. So I count my blessings every day,
Yeah, I mean, I think for those watching, I do SEO, but I do it mostly for small and medium-sized businesses. Kevin has worked with some of the most iconic technology brands you can think of, including Shopify. And so while there's some overlap, I feel like we have very different jobs. What does a typical day in the life of the director of SEO at Shopify do?
Yeah, it's such a good question, It is very focused on meetings. I have a large team. We're about 20 SEOs, or a bit over 20. We're hiring and growing the team more. So I'm a manager of managers, right? So a lot of my time is spent on making sure the machine runs smoothly. I remove roadblock for my team. I empower people. I help with direction of things. And then 2 or 3 or maybe 4% of my time I really spent on going really deep on something. Most of the time, I rely on my team to really do the super deep work, the thorough analysis, and then I try to kind of piece it together from a higher level. And then of course there's a lot of stakeholder management or other teams at Shopify that we collaborate with, that I'm building connections to and relationships. I'm reporting up to the VP of Growth at Shopify, who's Luc Levesque, also a very big household name. And so I'm making sure that we're pacing right against goals, that we're measuring the right things, that we have the right things on our radar and the biggest opportunities. But it's a lot of high level strategizing, relationship building, and then the kind of deep, thorough tactical work that's done by my teams.
I can only imagine. Well, will we see you in this new role? Will we see you at conferences? Will you still be a presenter once things pick back up?
Yeah, I love that question. I just finished my presentation this morning for SMX Munich, where I was lucky to present together with Marcus Tandler. It's like a tandem kind of presentation, which was amazing. And I still present. I'm still looking at SEO, following everything. I'm trying to get my hands as dirty as possible. That's on the one hand something that I don't make sure I display that to my team. I don't want to be the person who just hands off and delegates the boring things. I want to make sure I get my hands dirty in the trenches with them. And then on the other hand, I think it's also important to always have some sort of a connection, touch to how things are working, because I got the feeling that things move so fast and rapidly. And so if move rapidly and change rapidly as well. And so if you take too big of a step back and don't understand the mechanics anymore of SEO, the decisions you make on a strategic level are really poor. So I always try to be a little bit involved. And sometimes it's as simple as writing a couple of, title tags or meta descriptions, or doing a little bit of keyword research yourself. And I always learn something new about how this space works, right? And that's one big thing, maybe a challenge, but also an opportunity at Shopify. We have such a broad product that it touches so many areas that if you're not somewhat involved in what your audience cares about, you just fall behind.
Oh, for sure. I can only imagine. Well, you do, you're one of these people who make me feel guilty that I'm not working hard enough, because in addition to being the director of SEO at Shopify, you have your own website, put out your own content frequently. It's very, very well done. A lot of it's pretty academic. It's not easy content to produce. I wanted to talk about that. I believe the newsletter is called the Growth Memo.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of those. You talked in earlier this month, we're filming in March, about SERP volatility. This is a topic that's really interesting to me, and I think to a lot of our audience. What's really happening here, I think, is that Google has an effort to improve user experience and match the SERP more with the searcher's intent. And in order to do that, they have to do a certain amount of experimenting. When you start talking about an unstable SERP in this newsletter, that's where it gets sort of interesting to me. When you talk about that concept, what does that mean exactly, an unstable SERP?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. To take a quick step back, generally, Google distinguishes between 3 types of user intent. They mention and outline those in their quality rater guidelines. And there are the dominant, common, and minor user intent. That applies specifically for ambiguous queries. And so this is kind of the second concept we have to factor in here. The shorter a search is, the broader the more potential intents the searchers have, right? So if I look for something like sneakers, could be anything that I'm trying to do. And so the typical journey that searchers go through is they start with a very broad search and then slowly understand their problem and needs better, and then they refine it more and more. On a very good side, right, they would maybe click through even though they had a broad search, and that site would guide them to what they actually wanted. However, from a Google perspective or search engine perspective, they try to satisfy these 3 different types of intents in different ways. And because the real world changes, right, and Google tries to reflect and mimic what happens in the real world as good as possible, that definition or that goal of user intent can change as well. And so what that means is that for some queries, you see a constant change in, or not a constant, but like you see potential changes in even the dominant user intent. A good example is the keyword Wuhan, where it's now and probably forever symbolically related to the outbreak of the coronavirus, right? And before, maybe say like 14, 15, 16 months ago, it was just another region in China, right? Like just another, right? It's bigger than Manhattan or New York City, but you get my drift, right? So yes, that kind of intent changed forever, even the dominant intent, and that creates a certain volatility where, say, you were ranking for keywords related to Wuhan or for Wuhan itself, right? Your chances of ranking after that kind of world event are lower, right? Unless you create new content for it. On the other hand, when we take a step back and ignore the dominant user intent for a second, the minor and common user intent can change as well on an ongoing basis, right? Because on one hand, because the real world changes, on the other hand, because Google's understanding of content and the web gets better and better, right? They make big advances on natural language understanding and natural language processing. So all that kind of thrown together, which like we touched on like a couple of huge concepts that we can talk about for hours, right? But all that thrown together means that the results for a keyword can constantly change. Second, Google tests a lot of results, right? So sometimes they try to find the right SERP mix, the right kind of balance of search results that satisfy as many user intents as people have when they perform a certain search. And third, there's just there can be this rhythm of stability and instability where a SERP is stable when at least the top results don't change on an ongoing basis. And you see this in certain rank trackers. You see that very clearly, where for certain keywords, the top 5, top 6, sometimes top 8 they barely change week over week, day to day, month over month. And then there are also periods of instability where Google kind of either reevaluates whether they got the SERP mix right, whether they show the right results, or something else happens. And then it kind of goes all over the place. And you see that Google tests, okay, what happens when I put this result in the first position or that result on the 5th position, or maybe shuffle that a little bit. And then over time, it comes back to stability. And that's just important for us as SEOs to know for a couple of reasons. For one, it explains when traffic fluctuates and maybe even dips, and you haven't changed anything, which happens more and more. And second, it just helps us to find opportunities when there is a time of instability to keep track of how the SERP mix changes and to see if we can tweak, modify, or tune our content to come out on top.
Yeah, that's what I took away from your article, though, is this idea of an opportunity. So all of this is a bit unnerving, maybe. We were used to as SEOs, like, okay, you make a change, you watch that change in certain tools that you're using, and you evaluate whether it was effective or not effective. In an unstable world, the unstable SERP, that's harder to do, and it could be harder for a while. Where does the opportunity come in if you're a progressive thinker like you are?
Yeah, well, thank you for the compliment. The opportunity arises in an unstable SERP by it takes a bit of a manual work, right? This is hard to scale. There are ways with the Google Search Console API, but the opportunity arises in understanding where Google tries to go with this, right? And specifically, what you want to do is you want to monitor how results fluctuate. Does Google bring completely different sites or pages into the mix, or is it a shuffle of the existing results? You see that a lot, especially for very transactional keywords, where the dominant intent could be related to buying something or acquiring something, or so. That's where you see a lot of changes all the time. One of the greatest examples that come to mind is examine.com, which is also a domain that deals a lot with EAT, and there's like it's basically like a big myth, this domain. Like they've been like bouncing with traffic all over the place. But when I did some analysis very early on when this started to happen, what I saw is that for a lot of medical terms, shorthand keywords, Google would show ads all of a sudden and shopping ads. And so that user intent changed towards a more transactional intent where Google tried out, hey, what happens if people actually want to buy that type of stuff instead of learning more? And that completely threw the SERP mix overboard, where all of a sudden you had a lot of shops and e-commerce stores ranking in the top 10. So the opportunity there is to, it's not a guaranteed opportunity, but if you're an e-commerce player, all of a sudden you have a chance to rank for these keywords as well. If you're an informational site or a site that is more targets more informative queries, then it becomes tricky, right? Then you could think about, hey, should I create a page maybe where I sell something, or should I try to pivot more toward affiliate marketing, or how can I be a part of this more transactional SERP mix? So the opportunity depends on what actually changes, but just simply by having that awareness that there is something going on and there might be a reshuffling of rankings, that is the opportunity. And then what you do depends a little more on what Google is trying to do, but you want to be on trend with that.
Right. And I just think this is so interesting. And the way that one of the things that you've also written about in the memo is the systems thinking. So you're very good at looking at big trends and then bringing them down into a tactical into tactics that could help improve things. When you look at these unstable SERPs, do any patterns emerge for you? Is there anything that you have learned that you find to be true 99% of the time, or is it just it depends totally on what we're talking about?
Yeah, such a good question. Thank you. There is a lot of variability, which is kind of the first lesson that I took away from this. I started to look at that a lot in 2019, especially when I came to G2, because generally G2 is B2B software marketplace. They rank for a lot of software related and review related queries, which is a super competitive space, but also a space with heavy fluctuation. And that's where I developed this kind of understanding that Google kind of that SERPs for a query go through this kind of evolution, where in the beginning it's very all over the place, and then over time Google understands what exactly people want, and that's the stability and instability we talked about before.
Right.
And so the first lesson I took away from that is it varies from industry to industry. There's no kind of time of instability except for when core algorithms roll out. That is often when we see mixes all over the place, and there are a couple of patterns. One of them is a reversal. So for example, last year in 2020 we saw the May core update bring sites into one direction, and then in a lot of cases the December core update brought them back to baseline before.
Yeah.
Right. But the opposite exists as well, which is something I call reinforcement, where Google made a change in May, saw it was good, and then in December accelerated that even more. A couple of domains to look at as an example is Macy's versus Nordstrom, two of the biggest brick and mortar retailers in the US. You see exactly that happening, where Macy's gained a lot of traffic in May, and then they lost it again in December, and the exact opposite happened to Nordstrom, right?
Wow.
So it's fascinating. And these are huge implications. So when you dig deep, you see that first of all, there's a lot of variability, right? That's the first takeaway. The second one is that you need to look at these things at a keyword level. It's really hard to look at them at a domain level. And what I mean by that is you can see the changes in traffic at a domain level. But if you want to understand what's happening, you need to look at the keyword level. And what I saw with Macy's versus Nordstrom is that a lot of times Nordstrom just simply answered or had a better fit for the user intent. They just had a better experience and better results or categorization of their products to better help people, find what they were looking for. A good example, if you want to dive deep into that, is the keyword swimsuits or women's swimsuits, where you see that Macy's, they don't really have a swimsuits category. Nordstrom does. And so women, I don't recall exactly on top of my head how Macy's worded their category. It was somewhere ballpark there. There were some swimsuits in the product mix, but it wasn't exactly that fit. And it's this kind of subtlety that you want to look at. Another thing that I learned from looking at a lot of data across 2019 is the instability or kind of the variability of SERP features. So SERP features is what I call all the knowledge panels, image carousel, local packs, all the kind of augmentations and extensions that Google shows in the search results to provide users a good or maybe better answer. And I was very lucky to work with two data sets, very large. One was SERP features from 100,000 keywords that I got from Rank Ranger. That was all across 2019 desktop and mobile. And the other data set was from SEMrush and their traffic product, which was from the 1,000 largest domains across the world and how their traffic changed 2019, also on mobile and desktop. And by the way, I'm currently working on the 2020 version, so I'm heads down now with all the data to give an update. But what you see is that with this kind of SERP instability, SERP features fluctuate as well, and they fluctuate very heavily. So one of my favorite examples is local packs, where I did ask a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question before I dove into the data on Twitter, and the question was, do you feel like Google increased the number of local packs or decreased? And 2/3 of people said that they felt that Google had increased the number of local packs shown in the search results. And the data showed that is true in some cases, but not in every case, right? And this is where it gets interesting. In certain countries and on certain devices, Google did in fact show more local packs. But in other countries and on other devices, it was the exact opposite, right? Wow. And this is, excuse the background noise here, police driving by, but this is kind of the fourth or fifth takeaway that I had from this, is that there's not just a variability in the stability or instability in the search results when it comes to rankings. It goes on the user intent level, and we see the same thing in featured snippets. Very recently, we saw this kind of bigger thing where Google removed a lot of featured snippets overnight and then just brought them back, right, in the last couple of months. So that all goes to say that there are patterns, but there's not this one pattern that we see across the board.
Fascinating stuff. I want to make sure I get to one other thing before I let you go. You've been super generous with your time, but you did these predictions. You've been doing this for a little while now, and everybody likes predictions. So I wanted to revisit some from 2020 and talk to you about a couple of the ones from 2021. So one of the things that you predicted in 2020, by the way, not the easiest year to make predictions, given that you had no idea that COVID was happening. But your prediction was that audio and video will become table stakes for marketers. And I have a very simple question. How did this prediction hold up as we talk on video with an audio podcast accompaniment?
Yeah, it's probably the best evidence, right? The thing is, with these predictions, I do them for a couple of reasons. But I don't do them to look good, because you can only lose with predictions generally, right? The chance of you being right is very small. But I do them in one to put myself out there and to, it's very easy to hide behind saying, hey, we can't tell, like it depends on so many factors. But I wanted to kind of have a bit of skin in the game and make a couple of bold claims as I see them possible, just to to put myself out there a little bit. And then on the other hand, it does help you to think about the future a bit better and to think about how everything could be going. So I think so far the audio video prediction, I think that has held up very true during the pandemic. Not just but most marketers I know have really stacked up their video equipment, bought DSLRs, expensive mics, lighting, and all that kind of stuff. So I think so far I'm on a good trend there.
No, I couldn't agree more. So the other thing that I thought you were spot on, and I wonder how you knew this, was that you predicted purpose and opinions will become more important for brands. In the year of BLM, in the year of the election, this was spot on. What did you know that we didn't? And do you think this is a trend that has momentum in a non-election year?
Yes, I do think so. And the one thing that got me thinking about that was actually LinkedIn, where maybe even Facebook and Twitter, but where I saw this big swing from people following brands to people following people, which makes a lot of sense, right? But I think I would argue that the visibility of brands on social media these days is very, very low, unless you talk about like a Wendy's on Twitter or a couple of other brands. They do a decently good job, right? But people are less inclined, and have to dig out the data to support that claim, but people are less inclined to follow brands, and instead they follow people. However, the way that brands can, I want to say, make themselves more approachable and authentic is by taking a stand on certain things. And I've also noticed that when brands don't do that, there's always a risk when you take a stand, right? Like when you take an opinion or put yourself on one side, there's a huge risk involved. I think to a degree people become more polarized to a degree, or at least they voice that more. And so when you're silent, it's almost the same as when you take the wrong stance, which is the worst stance to take. So by at least taking one side, and you pick a side carefully, at least you address certain people, or you make yourself more relatable and authentic to certain people. And so I think the evolution of that brands are going through is that they cannot be these kind of corporations or faceless things anymore. You look at Elon Musk, you look at other big people, and they're kind of the representatives of the brands. And so that's why I think on one hand you have to have an opinion as a brand, you have to be part of the conversation. You always have to be, but especially because everything is so amped up these days, it's even more important. And that gives your brand a face and a character. And there are many great brands out there. REI and Nike are two examples who really understood that, and who I also want to say hold themselves to high standards in that regards, and that lands pretty well. So I figure I kind of got on that kind of sniff through LinkedIn, and then I kind of spun it a bit further, and I think I don't want to say like I saw all of this coming, but I maybe like got on the right track there.
Well, that was a good one. Let's talk about some for 2021. I had two that I highlighted. First was that Dinosaur Brands will continue to die, and this was a trend that continues from 2020. That basically you think that COVID was not the only reason, or even maybe the primary reason, that brands like Brooks Brothers and others have gone out of business or have filed for bankruptcy anyway. Who should be worried? What is a dinosaur brand exactly, and who should be worried if your prediction's correct?
I love how well you did your homework. Honestly, big kudos. Very thorough research. The thing with Dinosaur Brands is that the COVID pandemic is an accelerator of trends, right? It's not a change agent of trends, it's an accelerator. And what we observed at Shopify is that it catapulted at least e-commerce 10 years into the future, maybe even more. And the problem is that brands who had already been struggling with the digital transformation and getting online, or even just using cloud software, if they had been struggling before the pandemic, now they're really struggling, right? And so we saw some very surprising examples at Shopify, like Heinz Ketchup, for example. They spun up an e-commerce store, or like a Shopify store, within days and started to sell direct to consumer, which is amazing. And there are other examples of companies as well. I don't want to bash anybody too hard, but there are some examples of companies who completely fall behind that. And so I think e-commerce is one very tangible example, but the majority of companies in the world don't use cloud software these days, or cloud-based systems, right? There's still a lot of going on that's on premise, and so that is a huge risk. And that means that in this age of digital acceleration, in part induced or accelerated by COVID, if a brand isn't set up digitally, I think they open a huge vacuum or a huge gap that young startups can enter. And I see a lot of that, for example, now happening in the insurance and medical space, which is heavily regulated, but where the user experience, especially now that we're all from home, is so poor and is so bad that some young startups are gaining traction very quickly, right? It's the same with Zoom, of course. Yeah, makes perfect sense that they had a huge year and huge tailwinds. But then there's also smaller players like Whereby, which offer a better Zoom experience. There's Hopin, which just raised I think a couple $1 billion of funding again, and they provide event experiences. So it shuffles the cards, right? And when I'm talking about Dinosaur Brands, I'm mostly talking about older, more established brands that maybe have been on the market for 50 to 100 years, and for them it's just harder to pivot quickly, right? It's kind of, it's almost, I don't want to excuse that, but it's difficult when you work at a big corporation.
Yeah, I think that's the important point that you mentioned right at the beginning, is that this accelerated trends. This didn't create them. Last question on the predictions. This is more of an anti-prediction than a prediction, but the anti-prediction is that Apple will not launch a search engine. What do you make? Like, all fall, this is what I heard, that they're going to launch a search engine. There was some patents that were registered for. What do you make of Apple? What they're not launching a search engine. That's news to me. I thought this was a done deal.
Such a good question, because I just watched Tom Anthony give a fantastic presentation at SMX about Apple's search engine efforts. And so, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I don't. The clarification is that I don't think Apple will launch a search engines that competes with Google, right? I think, first of all, Google is the clear incumbent. Even players that have invested in this for decades, like Bing or DuckDuckGo, or even some others, they struggle to compete with Google. They're really they're sitting on a very tight seat. Plus, the space is at high risk to be regulated. So investing in a business that's potentially being regulated is a very weak position to be in, and it doesn't really kind of fit into Apple's business models. One thing that Tom pointed out was that Apple does show ads, for example, in the app stores, and that is right. They do have some marketplaces, but I highly doubt that Apple will open that up on a search engine. The one thing that would speak for it is that a former Google executive, John Gianandrea, a couple of years ago went from Google to Apple, right? So you could think that maybe that has something to do with it. However, I don't think they will launch an open search engine. I think what Apple is working on is a closed search engine, what will happen in Siri or on your iPhone when you look when you use the search function. And I think they will bring in more websites, gain a better understanding of the web, and potentially even some web apps. So I think they're building a modular search engine that pulls from several sources, and that's an experience that they want to bring to the users. But I don't think that's a competition to Google in the first place, because Apple launches that on their own hardware devices, right? Apple is not an open source company, right? They don't create something like Android that anybody can technically use. They want to create a crafted experience that is integrated with everything else. And so I think this will become part of the Siri experience, and it's not going to be this open search engine.
Well, it's very interesting. I got to remember to make sure I linked all these things in the show notes, because it's really, really well done. And you can look back at previous years, even 19 and 18, I believe you have predictions as well. Kevin, I have one last question for you before I let you go. What is your relationship to Chicago? Right before I got on here, I noticed that you have some relationship to Chicago. Search Lab is based in Chicago. Do you live here? Did you live here?
Yeah, we're due for a coffee or a beer then. I did move to Chicago, in fact. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area until about a half a year ago. I did move to Chicago. The motivation back then was primarily to be closer to my teams and colleagues at G2, because G2 is headquartered in Chicago. But I also, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for 6 years. I thought it was a good time to leave. I did not make the decision because of the pandemic. That was a bit before then. But then, of course, when it broke out, it was more or less of a no-brainer. And then I switched jobs to Shopify. So it kind of became a bit redundant, but I'm happy here. Chicago is a really cool city. It's of course a bit cold in the winter, but you find excellent barbecue here. And, it's a fun place to be. So I'm going to stay here for a while.
Kevin, I'm your tour guide here. If you ever need anything, let's go to a Cubs game. Let's go get a steak. This will be great. So now that I know this, we're going to be hanging out a lot more. So this is really cool. But I think for now, I think it's time to sign off. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Suds Search. This was a big get for us. I appreciate you doing this between a really packed schedule with your conference talk this morning. And I'm going to give you a virtual cheers, and we'll sign off for now and until we can hang out in the streets of Chicago.
Yeah, I'm game. Just let me know where and when, and I'll be there. But thank you so much. That was really, really well done. I had a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
All right. Likewise, Kevin. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.